Alright, so this week we're going to finish up Chapter 1 in Spielvogel. So if you haven't done it already, make sure that you're reading pages 7 through 36 in the textbook. These pages deal with two distinct but very similar and closely related civilizations, those of Mesopotamia and Egypt. For those who aren't aware about the geography, Mesopotamia is kind of a fancy way of saying ancient Iraq. And so we're talking about the area around ancient Iraq and ancient Egypt and the territory to some extent in between those two places. Now, when you're reading the chapter this week, I want you to pay particular attention to the various blue boxes that show up, such as this one on page 12 in the textbook. Now, what these blue boxes are examples of primary sources. These are actual excerpts from ancient historical sources describing more or less life from the perspective of somebody who lived in Egypt or Mesopotamia. The first of these documents is on page 12 and is called the Code of Hammurabi. And this is excerpts from one of the world's oldest law codes. So you're not just reading about the ancient Mesopotamian laws, you actually get a chance to read the ancient Mesopotamian laws. A few pages on, there are a couple of these primary sources coming from Egypt. There's one on page 20, which includes something called the Hymn to the Nile. Now, the Nile River played a vitally important role in Egyptian life, in its agriculture, and even in its religion. And you can see that here in this religious hymn the Egyptians wrote and sang to the Nile River. And then finally, a little bit further on, there is a blue box on page 30 called Akhenaten's Hymn to Aten and Psalm 104 of the Hebrew Bible. And this is one of the more interesting and a little odd documents in the chapter. Apparently, for a very brief period in Egyptian history, towards the end of the Egyptian period known as the New Kingdom, there was an Egyptian pharaoh named Amenhotep, or Akhenaten, and he converted to a form of monotheism. He only worshipped one god, the sun god, and he wrote a hymn to this sun god named Aten. And some scholars, at least, and you can draw your own conclusions when you read it, some scholars at least see distinct parallels between Akhenaten's hymn to Aten and Psalm 104 from the Jewish scriptures, the Old Testament. Now, in general, when you're reading this chapter, in addition just to getting a good sense of Egypt and Mesopotamia and life in these two regions, I want you to try to pay particular attention to the question of geography. How is it that the geography, in particular the rivers, impact Egypt and Mesopotamia differently? Both of these societies are going to be based primarily on riversides. Egypt along the Nile River, Mesopotamia along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And even though they're both in pretty much the same part of the world, the people are very similar in terms of their lifestyles. In Egypt, the Nile River is going to create a very different civilization than the Tigris and Euphrates create in Mesopotamia. So as you're reading this, think about some of the ways that the differences in those rivers create differences in other parts of Egyptian and Mesopotamian life.